Hello, I'm very happy to have the chance to talk to you, even though I miss the actual face-to-face contact, but I hope that you will still take this as an impetus for discussion and your own thinking. I have titled my presentation as What is worth learning? And it's a classic question, of course. Traditionally, it's been often approached through disciplines. Instead of disciplines, I will emphasize the more holistic aspects of learning and its connection to the societal changes that we're facing. But as a starting point, I would like to emphasize that human learning takes many forms. There's not just a single good way of learning. In this slide, I have divided learning into four broad fields. Traditional school learning represents the type of learning where initially learning has been designed for something that is in the future. In other words, in classical school learning, children were supposed to learn for their future, not for the present, not for the current activities, but those which emerge in the adulthood. So you could say that the traditional school learning has been exploitation of existing knowledge for future activity. And traditional workplace learning, apprenticeship, was also exploitation of existing knowledge, typically the existing skill and know-how at work represented by the competent masters. And it was geared to serve the existing work practices. Much of the classical apprenticeship learning has been aimed at smoothing out skills to make them as close as possible to the performance of a skilled existing master. Historically, more recent forms of learning are those that we may call problem-based, or problem-oriented, or project-based learning. Various constructivist theories of learning address these types of learning, in which learning is based on exploration of new knowledge, but it still serves existing activity. Take, for instance, problem-based learning in medical schools. It's not aimed to change medicine or medical profession, medical activity as such. It's aimed at making physicians more skilled and more inventive in their actual treatment of patients. In other words, you could say that it's exploiting novel knowledge, but for very limited projects and problems. Now, the fourth field of learning, which is on the upper right-hand corner, which is titled expansive learning, is the most problematic and the least well understood. That's where learning aims to generate new types of activity, but at the same time it explores new knowledge which is not yet fully established. In other words, it's the kind of learning where there is no competent teacher, where the contents of learning must be created while people are generating something new. And this type of learning is of course full of uncertainties. It's difficult and demanding, but it's also increasingly necessary, because we human beings are societies. We face increasingly situations for which there are no predefined solutions, or a fixed canon or knowledge is simply missing. It's sufficient to think about issues such as the climate change or various kinds of global crises that are occurring in our age. Typically, these are areas where learning is facing a double unknown. On one hand, the knowledge that needs to be learned is unknown, and also the activity which needs to be generated is unknown. And this type of expansive learning, I think, is a necessary addition to our repertoire of learning. The types of learning that we are used to mainly represent the three other fields in this picture. The fourth field needs to be added, and it probably will, and in the best case, it will also serve as a energizing and invigorating factor for the other types of learning. You could say that in traditional school learning, the outcome is correct solutions, correct answers, correct solutions, which are known ahead of time. And in traditional apprenticeship learning in workplaces, the outcome is correct procedures, correct ways to do the work, also known ahead of time. In problem and project-based learning, it's more about useful solutions and workable procedures. Whatever works in a particular given problem or particular given case. In expansive learning, it's actually entire new concepts for the activity that are needed. And new types of agency, new types of responsibility and initiative on the part of learners. This type of learning is indeed something that has, of course, always been there, but it's also been largely ignored by those who study learning and who analyze learning. Learning theories have been very weak in this area. To understand expansive learning, we might also point out that it's a longitudinal process. We are typically used to, in school settings, to relatively short chunks of learning. Traditionally, it's been a lesson. Nowadays, it's more a curriculum unit, which may take a few weeks, perhaps. But typically, the time periods into which learning is divided are relatively short. In expansive learning, you're talking about relatively long cycles of learning where something new is generated and put into practice. This type of learning is gradually emerging also in schools, but it's still in its infancy, where you may think about a whole year or even a longer period in the lives of the learners as the unit of learning. And learning then can be analyzed into stepwise actions, starting with the questioning the given situation, analyzing it, modeling new solutions, examining and testing them, putting them into practice, reflecting on the process, and eventually also consolidating and generalizing the outcomes. This type of cycle is obviously not quick, and it may take actually even more than a single year. So including this type of expansion into our repertoire of learning is my first point. My recommendation is that we think of learning in multiple forms. They are not mutually exclusive. Not one of them is better than the other, but they serve different purposes, and all of them are needed, and one of them has been sorely missing. This is my first argument. Now, the question still remains, what is to be learned, and how do we understand, how do we approach the what question? If we do not take the traditional idea of disciplines as the basis of curriculum, but if we take a broader view, namely, how is learning involved in societal development, societal change. I would like to think about this as a matrix. Here, on the vertical dimension, you have strategic competencies, which are broad competencies that cut across disciplines. And on the horizontal line up there, you have societal challenges. And obviously one can think of these societal challenges and strategic competencies in different ways. I'm not saying that this is somehow the only correct way to think about them, but I think at least it's worth to propose one example of this kind of thinking. And this is based obviously on a fair amount of research that we have conducted in our research unit here in Helsinki. The societal challenges that I'm taking up here, the first of all is digitalization. And digitalization does not mean just computers or adding some computer skills. It's a foundational transformation in the way the economy is run and goods and services are produced. In other words, it's comparable to previous industrial revolutions, but of course qualitatively radically different. And in fact, we are only now starting to see the full consequences of digitalization, even though it's been with us quite a while. It's a long and big wave of change, and we're in the middle of it. The second societal challenge that I would like to take up is global equity and collaboration. We often talk about globalization as a sort of either good or bad thing. Globalization often has a very ugly face because it turns into global exploitation of natural resources and human resources. However, at the same time, globalization means also radically increased interaction and collaboration between peoples around the globe. The crucial challenge, especially in this day and age when we see the huge waves of refugees and immigrants moving across national boundaries and borders, is the issue of global equity. How to eradicate poverty, how to build up sustainable livelihood for the entire globe. And this is not at all just a mission for United Nations or some specialized organization. It's a learning challenge, if you want, that pervades everything. If we don't tackle that in our institutions of education, we will be actually in trouble. In other words, along with the, let's say, the technological dimension, which is represented by digitalization, we need to keep the issue of equity in the global scale, because this threatens our very existence as a human race. And the third foundational challenge is obviously ecological sustainability. These are interconnected. These three big societal challenges are interconnected, but I think that we can argue that it's time to think of all schooling, all school-based learning in terms of how it actually meets these challenges and how the contents of learning are built to actually address these challenges and to prepare people to face them. And I think that these challenges need to be seen interconnected with strategic competencies. And also here on the vertical line, I would like to point out three types of strategic competencies. And these are based, of course, very much on studies of various kinds of work activities and work organizations, which has been the main line of research in my own research unit. the cradle. So the three strategic competencies that emerge when you study the changes in work are, first of all, what I might call boundary crossing and orchestration. The issues of how to actually find appropriate partners and domains of knowing in order to handle complex, what you might say, wicked problems, is becoming the kind of competence that has crucial importance for both economic success and, more broadly, for the survival of our ways of living and as human beings. So, crossing boundaries, both in terms of traditional cultural, national, ethnic boundaries, but also in terms of domains of knowing, domains of expertise and competence. Finding appropriate partners and building bridges between them, filling what have been called structural holes, meaning that crucial, potentially complementary actors are not involved with one another or not helping each other. These structural holes become a crucial issue of actually building up competence. Bringing together complementary actors when nobody alone can handle the wicked problems. We might call this the socio-spatial dimension of competence. In other words, navigating in space, in social space, to find unexpected potential combinations that can generate new powerful solutions. We have also called it knot working, and this means that building knots between unexpected partners that can solve problems and accomplish unexpected results together. This is different from traditional team working, where people were expected to stay together in a sort of fixed, stable formation. Knot working is very much bringing people together to accomplish something and dissolving and then forming another kind of knot. The second strategic competence that I emphasize is dealing with the past, present, and future. You could say that this is the socio-temporal dimension, the time dimension of competence. It has to do with remembering, learning from the past, often a very neglected competence in a day and age of instant, immediate, quick results. And it seems clear that if anything, our societies have gone too far in the idea of quick fixes, instant results. The long-term lessons, both from the past and projecting toward the future, are now more needed than ever before. This has to do with also building resilience. In other words, we live in a society and in a globe which is full of crises and conflicts and problems. And resilience, the ability to bounce back, to build again your activity, to continue, is becoming of crucial importance. And that requires working out critical conflicts by going to the past, finding the resources that are there, and building a future vision. So imagining and envisioning become a central element of this, constructing possible worlds, not only for, let's say, for the purpose of play and entertainment, but primarily in order to build our own futures. And the third strategic competence I would like to emphasize is agency and volition, taking responsible action. We have been used to already to ideas of social capital and perhaps various kinds of intellectual capital. What is emerging today is that volition, our capacity to take willful actions, to determine our own futures, which is also called agency, is becoming the most important asset any organization and any society can nourish. It's the direct antidote to issues of passivity, alienation, dropping out, refusing to vote, refusing to take part, saying that it's not for me. It's not just motivation. Mind you, I'm not talking about motivation in the sense of how to motivate students to be more active learners. This is more about the will to actually create and construct your own life and your own future. Agency or volitional action, it involves always breaking away from the given constraints and taking responsibility for the new. This is the duality of agency. And responsible volitional actions can be fostered by means of significant supporting artifacts. Maps, timelines, plans, visions. Human beings have always built their own future with the help of those. So I want to show you an example. This is from an African village from Ethiopia, where a village which was had actually deforested its own environment and was losing its livelihood, built collaboratively a map for the first time of its own environment, using the technique which is called participatory mapping. And this artifact, this collectively created map, served as a very powerful springboard for this village to collectively start taking actions to rebuild its own basis of livelihood, to start actually planting new trees and to change their own environment back to something that can be actually inhabited and in which life is possible. That's an example of the power of collective artifacts in the building of this type of competencies. Now, I would like to end with the final question back to, initially asked, what is worth learning? And I have tried to emphasize that what is worth learning is tightly connected to the future of our globe, the big challenges that we're facing, and it must be approached through broad domains or areas of strategic competence. But at the same time, we need to be aware that knowledge is a disputed concept. And the main line of dispute today goes between understanding knowledge as just another commodity that can be packaged, privately owned, and sold for profit. And on the other hand, knowledge as a common good that should be made open and accessible for everyone without charge. This duality, this tension, is very, very crucial for the future of education. And I would like to end this presentation by challenging you to also think about that when you think about what is worth learning. Thank you, and I wish you a very successful and interesting conference.